In the mahogany-paneled library, where the smell of leather and old paper mingled with the harsh Arizona sun, Wilbur Wood set down his wine glass. His daughter, Georgiana, had been standing there for 5 minutes, looking worried. "Father," she began, "Leroy has a wonderful business opportunity, and he needs me to mortgage this house." Silence fell. Wilbur stared at her, the gaze of a former prosecutor assessing a false testimony. "Do you know what you're asking?" he said, his voice eerily calm. "Please don't be so hard on him. He's your husband," Georgiana pleaded. "No," Wilbur replied, each word like a shard of ice. "He's a bad investment. And you, my child, are a price I'm no longer willing to pay." I guess 99% of you will hear this, sigh and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you, and where are you listening? The Arizona sunset bled across the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, a dramatic backdrop to the scene inside Wilbur's Scottsdale mansion. It was a view he'd paid millions for, one that was supposed to inspire tranquility. Tonight, it felt like a painted canvas, a beautiful lie. The light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the dining room, cast a jaundiced glow on the polished walnut table, making the Tiffany & Co. silverware gleam with an almost accusatory brightness under the shimmering crystal chandelier. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. Wilbur sat at the head of the table, a silent king in his own castle, observing. He was a collector of moments, of data points, and tonight he was gathering them with a quiet intensity. Across from him, his son-in-law, Leroy, fidgeted in his chair, the picture of a man at war with his own skin. Wilbur's daughter, Georgiana, sat between them, a desperate diplomat in a burgeoning Cold War. The clinking of cutlery against porcelain was the only sound for a long moment, a stilted rhythm against the backdrop of the desert evening. Then, Leroy pushed his chair back with a soft scrape that sounded like a scream in the silence. He walked over to the mahogany sideboard, his movements tight and deliberate. That's when Wilbur saw it. The bottle. A 25-year-old Macallan, its dark amber liquid glowing under the lamplight. A birthday gift from Wilbur just 6 months prior. He remembered the weight of the box in his hands, the smooth, cool glass of the bottle. He remembered Leroy's performative gratitude, his booming voice echoing in the hall. "Wilbur, this is too much. I'll save it. For a truly special occasion, a monumental occasion. I do have." What monumental occasion was this? A Tuesday dinner of grilled salmon and asparagus. Leroy uncorked the bottle with a flourish, the soft pop of the cork a declaration. He retrieved the heavy crystal tumbler and dropped in 3 ice cubes. The sharp clatter of ice hitting glass was like a gunshot. Then he poured. Not a sensible 2 fingers, but a full, deep pour, the whiskey sloshing almost to the brim. He didn't glance at Wilbur, didn't offer so much as a nod in his direction. It wasn't an oversight. It was a statement. Wilbur said nothing. He simply watched, cataloging the gesture. It was a small thing, a crack no wider than a hairline, but it was there. The first sign of stress in a structure that was supposed to be solid. Leroy returned to the table, swirling the whiskey in his glass, the amber liquid catching the light. He took a long, slow sip, closing his eyes as if he were savoring the taste of defiance. He set the glass down with a decisive thud. "I just can't believe Chief Hendricks," he began, his voice a low grumble that vibrated with manufacturer outrage. He was a senior vice president at a tech firm, a position Wilbur had helped him secure with a well-placed phone call, a fact that was never mentioned but always present. The man is an idiot, an absolute first-class moron. Georgiana placed her fork down carefully. "Leroy, please, not at the dinner table." "Why not?" Leroy shot back, his gaze fixed on the whiskey. "It's my life, isn't it? I spend 60 hours a week catering to the whims of a man who makes decisions based on his feelings." He practically spat the word. He turned down $1 million contract today, a done deal. Why? Because, and I quote, "it just didn't feel right." He snorted, a harsh, ugly sound. Felt, "In my world, Wilbur, we don't operate on emotions. We operate on results, on data, on the bottom line. And then it came. The pivot. The subtle, venomous shift of his contempt. He finally looked at Wilbur, a half smile playing on his lips, a patronizing glint in his eyes. But you don't understand that. After all, your world is about books and quiet afternoons, isn't it? The silence that followed was sick and suffocating. It was a direct hit, cloaked in the thinnest veil of civility. He wasn't just insulting his boss anymore. He was belittling Wilbur, dismissing his life's work as a novelist. The very work that had paid for this house, this table, this whiskey. He was painting Wilbur as a relic, a man out of touch with the real world of contracts and bottom lines. Wilbur felt Georgiana's eyes on him, pleading. He saw the tension in her jaw, the forced placidity of her expression. She was always the peacemaker, the one who frantically tried to spackle over the fissures. Well, she said, her voice a little too bright, a little too cheerful, as if she were trying to paint over a crack in the wall with a vibrant, distracting color. Speaking of quiet afternoons, Dad, you must tell us about the new rose bushes. Are the Mr. Lincolns blooming yet? Her attempt was clumsy, desperate. The crack was too wide to be ignored. Leroy's disrespect lingered in the air, a foul odor. The Arizona sunset had finally died, leaving the room in the artificial, sterile light of the chandelier. The view of the golf course was now just a black void. Wilbur didn't answer his daughter. He didn't look at Leroy. He simply turned his head and gazed out the window, past his own reflection, toward the garden his late wife had so meticulously tended. The roses were out there, their blooms invisible in the darkness, but he knew they were there. He had pruned them himself just yesterday. He had felt the thorns. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his water. He collected data. He observed the full glass of whiskey, a symbol of his generosity, now a weapon of disrespect. The carefully chosen words, designed to diminish and provoke, the desperate, fluttering panic of his daughter, caught in the crossfire. An old lion, lying still, but aware of every twitch, every scent on the wind. He thought to himself, his mind calm and clear as ice. Patience isn't a virtue, it's a strategy. He held his gaze on the dark garden, a silent promise forming in the depths of his mind. But every strategy has an endgame. The silence that followed Georgiana's desperate attempt to change the subject was heavy and brittle, like a sheet of thin ice stretched over deep, dark water. Leroy seemed to relish it. He leaned back in his expensive oak chair, the wood groaning in protest, as if it, too, felt the strain. The dining room, once a symbol of expensive luxury, now felt claustrophobic, the walls closing in. On the damask paper walls, the portraits of Wilbur's ancestors, stern-faced men and women painted in oil, seemed to look down with collective judgment, their painted eyes following Leroy's every move. He took another long, slow swallow of the Macallan, draining the glass. The whiskey had untethered him, loosening the moorings of his already flimsy respect. He was no longer just complaining. He was prowling, looking for a weakness, a soft spot to sink his teeth into. You know, he said, his voice syrupy with false contemplation, I was just thinking. He gestured vaguely with the now empty tumbler, a sloppy, sweeping motion that encompassed the room, the house, the manicured grounds beyond. You built all this. Good for you. The compliment was hollow, a Trojan horse carrying an army of insults. But it must be comfortable, living like royalty, while the rest of us are out there in the trenches, actually working. We'll know that in the free there is an amen. Georgiana made a small, wounded sound, a faint whimper of protest. Leroy, that's not fair, isn't it? He ignored his wife, his focus narrowing entirely on Wilbur, a predator locking onto his prey. You've forgotten what it's like to fight every day, to claw for every inch. Now you just sit here on your throne. He stared at his father-in-law, a sneer twisting his lips. He was no longer just insecure. He was openly hostile, his resentment a raw, festering wound. And as soldiers out there, we need supplies to keep fighting the war. He held out the empty crystal glass, a mock offering. The bottle of Macallan sat on the sideboard, a good 10 feet away. The bottle's way over there, Leroy said. his voice dropping into a tone of insolent command. "And I'm comfortable right here." He looked Wilbur square in the eye, the final, unforgivable insult delivered with a chilling casualness. "Get me more whiskey, old man." The air crackled. The two words hung there, obscene and deliberate. It was a line crossed, a gauntlet thrown down on the polished walnut table. Georgiana gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Leroy, stop it. Apologize to my father right now." But Wilbur didn't need his daughter to defend him. The observer was gone. A lifetime of quiet patience had reached its strategic endgame. Slowly, with a grace that defied his years, Wilbur rose from his chair. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply stood, and the sheer force of his presence seemed to suck the air from the room. He placed his hands on the back of his chair, his knuckles white. When he spoke, his voice was not the gentle tone of a retired novelist. It was the voice of another man, from another lifetime, the voice of Assistant District Attorney Wilbert Hayes, a voice that had silenced hardened criminals, swayed juries, and commanded the unwavering attention of a courtroom. It was a voice of cold, sharp steel. "I worked for 3 decades, he began, his words precise, each one a carefully placed stone building, a wall of indisputable fact. For 30 years, I stood in courtrooms and put men far more dangerous than you, Leroy, behind bars. Men who lived by the sword and died by it. This house," he said, his gaze sweeping the room before landing back on his son-in-law with unnerving intensity, "isn't a throne, it's a verdict. It is a verdict on a life of hard work, of service, of upholding the law when others sought to break it." He took a step from behind the chair, his posture erect, his authority absolute. "Do not ever," he said, the words now clipped and dangerous, "confuse my retirement with your resentment." The attack was so swift, so surgically precise, that Leroy was momentarily stunned into silence. He had expected anger, shouting, a satisfying emotional outburst. He had not expected this cold, methodical dismantling of his entire worldview. He had defined work as his brutal corporate skirmishes, his war for profits. Wilbur had just redefined it as 30 years of serving justice. The confrontation wasn't about a glass of whiskey anymore. It was about honor. It was about the very definition of a man's worth. Humiliation warred with rage on Leroy's face. His cheeks flushed a deep, mottled red. He was cornered, exposed, and he lashed out, clinging to his last shred of dominance. He ignored Wilbur's monumental statement, reverting to the petty tyranny he understood. He shook his empty glass again, a petulant rattle of ice. "I don't need a lecture," he snarled. "I need a drink, now." Wilbur looked him straight in the eye, his expression unyielding, his calm a terrifying counterpoint to Leroy's unraveling fury. "There are no servants in this house," he said. The statement was final, absolute. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the sound of Leroy's ragged breathing. The verbal assault had failed. The attempt to dominate, to diminish the old man, had been utterly rejected. And in that moment of pure, undiluted humiliation, words failed him. With a guttural roar of frustration, Leroy slammed the heavy crystal tumbler down onto the table. The sound was a violent explosion in the pristine silence, a sickening crack of crystal against wood. The glass didn't shatter, but the impact echoed through the room like a gunshot, a definitive, irrevocable act of violence that signaled the end of conversation and the beginning of something far more terrifying. The echo of the slammed glass faded, but a new, more menacing silence took its place. The dining room had transformed. It was no longer a home. It was a courtroom. The brilliant crystal chandelier overhead was no longer a symbol of wealth, but a harsh, interrogating light shining down on the defendant, Leroy, whose chest heaved with ragged, whiskey-fueled breaths. The family portraits on the wall were no longer ancestors. They were the jury, their painted eyes cold and assessing. Wilbur remained standing, his posture unchanged. He felt a strange, detached, calm settle over him, the old, familiar feeling of being in control, of seeing the path to a conviction laid bare. He looked at his son-in-law, a man unraveling thread by thread. "You are a guest in this house, Leroy," Wilbur said, his voice as cold and smooth as ice. It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact, a final warning. "You might want to remember that." Leroy let out a short, manic bark of a laugh that was utterly devoid of humor. "Guest," he spat, the word dripping with contempt. "No, I'm the future." "You," he said, jabbing a finger in Wilbur's direction, "are the past, a museum piece." He pushed himself away from the table and stalked toward Wilbur, closing the distance between them until he was just inches away. The cloying scent of expensive whiskey and a sour undercurrent of desperation washed over Wilbur. Leroy was a cornered animal, all bluster and fear. "Pour my drink," he hissed, his voice low and guttural, a parody of command. Wilbur didn't flinch. He didn't move. He simply held his ground, his stillness, a more powerful rebuttal than any word could ever be. He was a stone wall against which Leroy's pathetic wave of aggression was about to break. This silent, immovable defiance was the one thing Leroy could not tolerate. It was a mirror reflecting his own inadequacy, and it drove him over the edge into madness, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. "Servants must obey," he roared, the words tearing from his throat. And then everything went into slow motion. His arms swung out, a clumsy, violent arc. The Waterford crystal goblet, a wedding gift, Wilbur remembered with a sudden, searing clarity. From him and his late wife to Georgiana and this man left Leroy's hand. It wasn't just a glass. It was a memory, a symbol of a promise, now being hurled back in his face. Wilbur watched it fly, his prosecutor's mind noting every detail with chilling precision. He saw the intricate crystal facets catching the light of the chandelier, splintering it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. He saw the remaining amber liquid trailing behind it like the tail of a comet, a beautiful, deadly trajectory across the subtly vast space of the dining room. Through the archway, he could see the front door, solid and closed. The house was a prison, a private stage for this final, irreversible act. The impact was not a loud crash, but a dull, sickening thud against his temple. For a split second, there was only the sensation of pressure, followed by a spiderweb of white-hot pain. Then came the sound, the delicate, tragic shattering of crystal as the goblet hit the marble floor behind him. A warm liquid, thicker than whiskey, trickled down the side of his face. He didn't need to touch it to know it was blood. "Oh my God!" Georgiana's scream finally ripped through the silence, thin and terrified. But what happened next was the true moment of impact, the blow that struck deeper than any piece of crystal. Georgiana ran, but she didn't run to him. She ran to Leroy. She threw her arms around her husband, her attacker, pulling him back as if he were the one in danger. Her body became a shield for the man who had just assaulted her father. "Let me handle this, Dad," she cried, her voice choked with tears and panic. But her actions spoke a different truth. She was handling the perpetrator. She was protecting the guilty. Leroy stood there, panting, his rage beginning to recede, replaced by a dawning, slack-jawed horror at what he had done. Georgiana clung to him, her sobs muffled against his chest, her loyalty made painfully, brutally clear. They were a tableau, frozen under the courtroom lights. The defendant and his fierce, misguided defender. And Wilbur was the victim, the key witness, standing alone. The silence returned, profound and absolute, broken only by his daughter's weeping for the wrong man. Slowly, Wilbur raised a hand to his temple. His fingers came away slick and crimson. He looked at the blood on his fingertips, the undeniable evidence. He looked at his daughter, cocooning the man who had put it there. The physical pain was already beginning to dull, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. The case was closed. The confession was signed in blood. He threw the glass. Wilbur thought, his mind sharp and precise as a scalpel. But Georgiana, she delivered the verdict. The click of the guest suite door shutting upstairs echoed in the cavernous silence. Wilbur was alone. He stood motionless in the wreckage of his dining room, the throb at his temple a dull, distant ache. It was nothing compared to the sharp, visceral pain of the memory now seared into his mind. Georgiana, his daughter, running past him, her arms reaching not for the father who was bleeding, but for the husband who had committed the assault. That single instinctive act was a betrayal so profound it eclipsed the physical violence entirely. His gaze swept the room, not with the eyes of a homeowner, but with the cold, assessing stare of a prosecutor. The space was no longer a place of family dinners. It was a crime scene. Moonlight silvered the edges of the shattered Waterford crystal scattered across the mahogany floor. On the far wall, the portraits of his ancestors seemed to serve as a silent, stony jury. He listened. A profound silence emanated from the guest suite upstairs, not the sound of remorse, but of cowardice. They were waiting, hoping the old man would simply sweep the shards of glass and dignity under the rug. They had forgotten who he was. With a newfound, chilling purpose, Wilbur turned and walked from the room, leaving the scene untouched. A perfect tableau of domestic violence. He ascended the grand staircase and entered the guest bathroom, its marble and chrome gleaming under the vanity lights. He faced his reflection, and for the first time in a decade, he saw the man he used to be. The cut was a livid gash against his temple, and a smear of drying blood painted a stark line down his cheek. His shirt collar was stained. This was not a wound to be hidden. It was an affidavit. A prosecutor knows, he murmured to the man in the mirror, his voice a dry rasp, that the story isn't just in the testimony. It's in the physical evidence. My face, this room, this is now Exhibit A. His hands, surgeon steady, went to work. He dampened the cloth and carefully patted the skin around the gash. But he did not wash the wound itself, nor the damning track of blood. He would not take a painkiller. He would not apply a bandage. The evidence had to be preserved in its most visually potent state. Downstairs, he draped the blood-stained shirt over a clean armchair in the hall, another piece for his collection. He retreated to the library and closed the heavy doors, encasing himself in the familiar scent of leather and old paper. He did not turn on the lights. Sinking into his armchair, he began his vigil. He did not grieve. He did not rage. He planned. He spent the long, dark hours not in sorrow, but in preparation, dismantling their future excuses and weaving a net of irrefutable facts. The drunkenness, the pressure at work, the tearful pleas for family unity, he saw them all coming, and he prepared the cold, hard counter-arguments for each. He was no longer a father. He was an officer of the court, preparing his case. Dawn broke at 6, the soft gray light creeping into the library. This was the optimal time. He knew the bruise would have blossomed overnight. He pulled out his phone, opened the camera, and turned the lens on himself. The face that stared back from the screen was a prosecutor's dream. The cut was an angry red, and the spectacular mottled bruise had spread across his temple and cheekbone in ghastly shades of purple and blue. Methodically, he began. He documented the injury from every angle, the clinical clicks of the phone's shutter, the only sound in the house. He then walked through the silent rooms, his phone held aloft like a lantern. He photographed the shattered crystal glinting in the morning light. He photographed the overturned chair. He photographed the bloody shirt in the hall. Each image was a time-stamped fact, each one a nail. At precisely 6:30 a.m., his collection complete, he returned to the library and dialed the non-emergency number for the Scottsdale Police Department. He had no need for the panic of 911. He was not a victim in distress. He was a complainant in absolute control. Scottsdale Police. A calm voice answered. Wilbur's own voice was level, professional, devoid of any tremor or emotion. "Good morning," he said. "I wish to report an assault that occurred in my home last night." He paused for effect. "The perpetrator is still on the premises. I am the victim." After providing his name and address, he politely declined the offer of medical assistance. "I am fine," he stated. The lie a strategic masterstroke. Just send the police. He ended the call and set the phone down. Outside, the Arizona sun was beginning its ascent, casting long shadows across the perfect lawn. Wilbur leaned his head back against the cool leather of his armchair, the ache in his temple, a dull reminder of the verdict he was about to deliver. He closed his eyes and listened to the silence, knowing it was about to be broken by the righteous, authoritative sound of a siren. He was a general, waiting for a battle that had already been won. The sound began as a faint, almost imperceptible disturbance in the quiet dawn, a low hum that grew steadily into the unmistakable, approaching wail of a siren. It was a sound that belonged to a different world, to the chaotic, untidy lives Wilbur saw on the nightly news, not to the manicured, sun-drenched tranquility of his Scottsdale neighborhood. Yet here it was, coming for his house. He stood by the library window, a cup of untouched black coffee in his hand, and watched as the Scottsdale PD cruiser pulled up to the curb, its passage as disruptive as a shark in a koi pond. He felt a curtain twitch in the house across the street. Mrs. Gable, of course. The audience was assembling. By the time the doorbell chimed, its melodic tones a bizarrely cheerful announcement of the law's arrival, Wilbur was already there. He opened the solid oak door to find two uniformed officers standing on his marble porch. They were young, professional, their faces impassive. "Mr. Hayes?" the taller one asked. "Yes, officers. Thank you for your prompt response," Wilbur said, his voice calm and welcoming, as if he were greeting colleagues for a morning meeting. He stepped aside. "Please, come in." He led them not into the formal living room, but directly to the scene of the crime. The morning light flooding the dining room was merciless, illuminating every shard of crystal on the floor, every dark smear on the discarded shirt. Wilbur didn't offer a frantic, emotional story. He presented a case. The incident occurred at approximately 9:15 p.m. Last night, he began, his tone objective and factual. The perpetrator, my son-in-law, Leroy Evans, became verbally abusive, culminating in him throwing this crystal goblet at my head. He gestured to the floor, then pointed to his own bruised and gashed temple. The officer's eyes followed his gesture, their professional neutrality flickering for a half second. The injury was impossible to ignore. The perpetrator is currently upstairs in the north guest suite with my daughter, his wife. He led them into the hall and indicated the shirt on the armchair. This was the shirt I was wearing. The officers exchanged a brief, knowing glance. They had seen this 100 times, but rarely was it laid out for them with such dispassionate, organized clarity. This wasn't a messy, hysterical domestic dispute. This was a prosecutorial brief. "Sir, we'll need to go speak with him," the shorter officer said. "Of course," Wilbur replied. This way, he led them up the grand, sweeping staircase. Each step on the plush runner seemed to absorb all sound, creating a tense, expectant hush. He stopped at the guest suite door and stepped back, ceding jurisdiction. The taller officer knocked 3 sharp, authoritative raps that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. A moment later, the door opened. Georgiana stood there, dressed in a silk robe, her face puffy and stained with tears. Behind her, Leroy, looking pale and disheveled, blinked in the hallway light, his face a mask of hung-over confusion. Then he saw the police uniforms. And then he saw his father-in-law, standing a few feet away, his face a brutal testament to the night before. The confusion in Leroy's eyes curdled into dawning, sickening comprehension. "Leroy Evans?" the officer asked. Leroy could only nod dumbly. "Sir, we're investigating a report of an assault," the officer continued, his voice calm but firm. "I need you to step out into the hall." That was the moment Georgiana's fragile composure shattered. As the officers began to place Leroy's hands behind his back, she didn't protest to them. She launched herself at her father. "How could you?" she shrieked, her voice a raw, ragged thing. "He's family! You call the police on your own family!" The clinical, metallic click of handcuffs closing around Leroy's wrists echoed in the opulent hallway. One of the officers began reading Leroy his Miranda rights, the familiar words, a surreal incantation in the quiet luxury of the home. "You have the right to remain silent." Georgiana grabbed Wilbur's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "Dad, please, stop this. Think about the neighbors. Think about his career. You're destroying us." Her words were a fusillade of misplaced priorities, neighbors, career, the pristine image of their lives. There was no mention of the crime, no acknowledgement of the violence. Wilbur looked at his daughter, and for the first time, the co-prosecutor felt a pang of genuine, wrenching sorrow. He was not just looking at his child, he was looking at a stranger, a woman whose moral compass had been so warped she could no longer distinguish between victim and perpetrator. He looked her directly in the eyes, his voice low, not with anger, but with the weight of a terrible, final lesson. The law doesn't stop at the front door, Georgiana, he said, his words precise and devastating. He made his choice when he threw that glass. I'm simply documenting it. He paused, letting the truth of his next words land with their full, crushing weight. What would you have me teach you now, that in this house, violence has no consequences? She stared at him, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. She had no answer. She had expected a negotiation, a family argument. She had received a verdict. He watched as the police led a now completely docile Leroy down the stairs and out into the bright morning sun. The irony was palpable. The man who had tried to play king was being led out of his borrowed castle in chains. Georgiana followed them, a desperate, sobbing mess, her pleas trailing off as the squad car door shut with a solid, final thud. The car pulled away from the curb, its red and blue lights silent. Wilbur stood in the open doorway, watching it disappear down the street. Georgiana had collapsed onto the marble steps of the porch, her body racked with sobs. He looked at her for a long moment, then turned and walked back into the house, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The lock clicked into place, the sound definitive. An ending and a new beginning. He walked past the crime scene, past the bloody shirt, and went directly into the gleaming, silent kitchen. He opened the canister, scooped fresh beans into the grinder, and pressed the button. As the machine whirred to life, filling the house with the rich, familiar aroma of coffee, he stared out the window at his pristine, orderly garden. The day had begun. While Leroy sat stewing in the sour, recycled air of a Maricopa County holding cell, Wilbur was in a different kind of government building. He sat on a polished wooden bench in a quiet, air-conditioned courtroom, the air smelling faintly of floor wax and old paper. The judge, a woman with tired eyes who had seen every flavor of human misery, looked down at the documents before her. A copy of the police report from that morning and a series of glossy 8x10 photographs. The photos were of Wilbur's face, the bruised and broken skin around his temple rendered in vivid clinical detail. Wilbur spoke calmly, his voice resonating with the quiet authority of a man who understood the room's language. He wasn't a hysterical victim. He was a concerned citizen, a former officer of the court outlining a clear and present danger. Your Honor, he said, the assault was unprovoked and executed with extreme prejudice. Given the perpetrator's escalating aggression and lack of remorse, I have a legitimate and pressing fear for my safety. There was no debate. The evidence was irrefutable. The judge stamped the paperwork with a heavy thud of finality. Wilbur had his emergency protective order. 26 hours after being led from the house in handcuffs, Leroy Evans was spat out of the system. The humiliation of being processed, fingerprinted, and held in a crowded, noisy cell with men whose crimes he'd only ever read about had scraped him raw. He stepped out of the Maricopa County Detention Center and into the brutal, bleaching heat of the afternoon sun, blinking like a man emerging from a cave. The air of freedom, thick with the smell of asphalt and exhaust fumes, had never tasted so sweet. He saw Georgiana waiting in her silver Mercedes, the engine running, the air conditioning a shimmering promise of a life he was desperate to reclaim. He slid into the buttery leather of the passenger seat, the familiar scent of his wife's perfume a comforting balm. He was out. The worst was over. I cannot believe he did that, Leroy rasped, his throat dry. We'll get a lawyer. We'll fight this. He's an old man. He overreacted. He was still mapping out his defense when a sharp rap on the window made him jump. A man in a nondescript polo shirt stood there, holding a clipboard and a sheaf of papers. Georgiana, weary and on edge, lowered the window a few inches. Leroy Evans? The man asked, his tone flat and impersonal. Leroy, still dazed, nodded. The man slid the packet of papers through the opening in the window. You've been served. He said it with all the emotion of someone announcing the time. Before Leroy could even process the words, the man was walking away, disappearing into the shimmering heat of the parking lot. What is it? Georgiana asked, her voice thin with exhaustion. Probably just more paperwork from the court. Release forms or something, Leroy muttered, tearing open the large envelope. He scanned the first page, his brow furrowed in confusion. He read it again. The look of relief on his face slowly dissolved, replaced first by bewilderment, and then by a pale, slack-jawed shock. The color drained from his face as if a plug had been pulled. He stammered, the words catching in his throat. He can't do this. He thrust the papers at his wife. He can't kick me out. Georgiana, this is our home. Georgiana took the document, her eyes scanning the bold, block letters at the top. Emergency order of protection. She read the dense, legalistic phrases. Is hereby restrained from coming within 500 yards of the residence. Prohibited from contacting the plaintiff, Wilbur Hayes, by any means. Effective immediately. She looked up from the page, her gaze drifting blankly across the vast, dusty parking lot, filled with cars and lost souls. The reality crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. Oh my God, Leroy, she whispered, the words barely audible. We can't go home. Rever. They sat there in the climate-controlled silence of the Mercedes, two impeccably dressed refugees in a sea of asphalt. Home was a mansion in Scottsdale with a golf course view. But, according to the legally binding document in her hands, home was now the one place on earth they were forbidden to go. His kingdom, once a sprawling estate, was now a rented sedan in a parking lot that smelled of despair. The humiliating hunt began. They couldn't check into the Phoenician or the Four Seasons. Their names were too well known. The questions would be too sharp. They drove aimlessly. The pristine dashboard GPS, a mocking reminder of a destination they no longer had. They ended up in a different Scottsdale, the one tourists didn't see, looking at a drab, stucco complex that offered furnished weekly rentals. The apartment they were shown smelled of stale cigarettes and disinfectant, a sad beige box with scratchy polyester sheets, and a view of a dumpster. This was the consequence. This was the verdict. Back in his fortress, Wilbur's phone buzzed. It was a text from Georgiana. We need to get his things. Wilbur read the message and set the phone down on his library desk. He didn't reply. Instead, he picked up the phone and dialed the number for a 24-hour locksmith he found online. An hour later, as the sun began to set, a quiet, efficient man in a blue jumpsuit replaced every lock on every door of the house. Wilbur stood in the grand marble entryway and listened. The sharp, definitive click of the new deadbolt sliding into place was the most satisfying sound he had ever heard. It was the sound of victory. He had secured the physical space. He had won the first battle. But Wilbur knew this was not just about a single night of violence. It was about a deeper rot, a weakness he had allowed to fester in the heart of his family. The arrest and the restraining order were merely containment. Now, it was time to uncover the source of the disease. He sat down in his leather armchair, opened his laptop, and typed a simple query into the search bar. Private investigator, Scottsdale. The war had just begun. I guess 99% of you will hear this, sigh and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe, even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you, and where are you listening? The man Wilbur hired was not the kind of private investigator you see in the movies. Robert Chen was a quiet, meticulous man in his late 50s who looked more like a tenured professor than a detective. He operated out of a sterile, anonymous office in North Scottsdale, and his specialty was not infidelity but financial forensics. He was a bloodhound for numbers. They met in Wilbur's library, the scene of so many of his recent strategic decisions. I'm not interested in gossip or rumors, Wilbur stated, his voice devoid of emotion. He looked at Chen, one professional to another. I don't need to know what he did last night. I need to know who he has been for the last 5 years. He slid the check across the polished surface of the desk. Be thorough and be discreet. Chen nodded, his expression unreadable. You have my report. 3 weeks passed. The house was quiet. The locks were new. Georgiana's calls had dwindled from frantic and accusatory to sullen and infrequent. They were staying, she said, in a corporate apartment while they sorted things out. Wilbur knew what that meant. He didn't argue. He waited. The silence in the mansion was not peaceful. It was the heavy, charged calm before a storm. The deep breath a predator takes before the strike. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning. The subject line was a single word: report. Wilbur opened it, his heart a steady, cold drum in his chest. Attached was a 47-page PDF. He didn't read it on the screen. He sent it to his printer, standing by the machine as it whirred and hummed, spitting out page after page. The stack of paper felt warm in his hands, like secrets freshly unearthed from the earth, still radiating the heat of their burial. He sat down at his desk and began to read, entering the meticulously documented secret life of his son-in-law. The first few pages were what he had expected, only worse. Leroy was a man drowning in debt, a leased Porsche he couldn't afford. Credit card statements from Neiman Marcus and Capital Grille that read like a cry for help, balances maxing out at $20,000 and $30,000. He was leveraged to the hilt, a man living a life financed by smoke and mirrors. Wilbur felt a grim, unsurprising confirmation. This was the portrait of an insecure, reckless man. He turned the page, and the confirmation curdled into something hot and acidic in his gut. It was a summary of Georgiana's retirement account, a 401 she had diligently contributed to for 15 years. Wilbur saw the statement from 6 months ago, and then the most recent one, and he saw the withdrawals. Small at first, a few thousand here and there, classified as hardship loans. Then, a larger one, just 2 months ago. $15,000. Gone. He saw the digital signature authorizing the transfer. Georgiana's name. A signature he knew she would never have willingly provided. Leroy wasn't just reckless. He was a thief. He was stealing his wife's future to pay for his extravagant present. The anger was a physical thing, a white-hot flash that made his hands tremble. He wanted to throw the report across the room, but he forced himself to take a slow, deep breath. He had to keep reading. He had to see it all. And then he reached the final section. Interviews with colleagues. Chen had been thorough. He'd spoken to 3 of Leroy's co-workers, men he drank with, under the guise of a background check for a fictitious executive position. The interviews had taken place at an upscale bar in the Kierland Commons, a place of soft jazz and clinking glasses, where the city's ambitious players congregated to brag and posture. He read the first transcript, then the second. By the third, the anger had been replaced by a chilling, reptilian coldness. He was no longer looking at a simple story of debt and theft. He was looking into the abyss. One colleague, celebrating a deal a few months prior, recounted a conversation after Leroy had had too many old fashions. He clapped me on the back, the man was quoted as saying, and he slurred, "You guys are playing checkers, I'm playing chess. While you're chasing commissions, I'm waiting on a multi-million-dollar estate. Just gotta play the part of the loving son-in-law for a little while longer." Wilbur's blood ran cold. He read the next paragraph, his eyes scanning the words as if they were written in a foreign language. The colleague explained further. Leroy called it his inheritance strategy. He was talking about moving in with you. He said the old man wouldn't last much longer, and the house was an $850,000 guaranteed return on investment. His words, not mine. Investment. The report fell from his fingers, the pages scattering across the desk. It all clicked into place. Every cloying compliment, every false gesture of affection, every moment of performative concern. The move into his house wasn't an act of necessity. It was a planned invasion. The kindness was an act. The marriage, a vehicle. Leroy hadn't just been disrespectful that night at dinner. He had been an investor checking on his asset and finding the asset Wilbur himself to be annoyingly resilient. The silence in the library was no longer charged. It was dead. Wilbur sat there for a long time, staring at the scattered pages. He was not dealing with a hot-tempered fool who drank too much and spent money he didn't have. He was dealing with a predator, a cold, calculating parasite in human form, who had attached himself to his daughter with the sole purpose of draining her and then him of everything they had. He realized, with a clarity that was both terrifying and galvanizing, that his daughter was not just married to a thief. She was the unknowing victim of a long con, her innocence a more potent danger than her husband's calculated cruelty. This wasn't about punishment anymore. This was about rescue. Wilbur sat in the deep silence of his library. The 47-page report from Robert Chen spread across his desk like a blueprint of a betrayal. The words from the transcript echoed in his mind. Inheritance strategy. Guaranteed return on investment. It was so clinical, so devoid of emotion. Leroy didn't see a family. He saw a portfolio. He didn't see a father-in-law. He saw a depreciating asset. A cold, hard clarity settled over Wilbur, displacing the last vestiges of grief. He was a man who had spent his life understanding contracts, evidence, and consequences. Leroy had made the mistake of viewing his marriage and his life in Wilbur's home as a business transaction. Very well. Wilbur would respond in kind. He looked at a photo of his late wife, Eleanor, on the corner of his desk. He would protect what she had helped him build. He would protect the daughter she had loved, even if it meant his daughter would hate him for it. He picked up the phone. He knew exactly who to call. The law offices of Patricia Lowell were in a gleaming tower in the Biltmore district, a world of hushed carpets, mahogany walls, and leather-bound books that smelled of money and precedent. Patricia was a sharp, impeccably dressed woman in her 60s who had been Wilbur's probate attorney for 2 decades. She had drafted his original will, the one that left his considerable estate to Georgiana, his only child, unconditionally. She listened patiently as Wilbur laid out his instructions. Her professionally placid expression slowly tightened as he spoke. When he finished, she removed her reading glasses and set them carefully on the polished desk between them. "Wilbur," she said, her voice laced with a caution that bordered on alarm. "This is highly unorthodox. It's coercive. You're essentially forcing your daughter's hand in her marriage. A clause like this could be contested." "Ollier." Wilbur met her gaze, his own eyes as steady and unyielding as granite. There was no hesitation in his voice, only the flat certainty of a man who had weighed every option and chosen his path. "Patricia, I am not forcing her hand. I am revealing his," he stated, the words precise and cold. "He married her under a false pretense. He sees my estate not as a legacy for his wife, but as the final payout on his investment in her. This will simply make the transaction terms clear. I think it's right for more first comment." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping, but gaining an intensity that made the air in the room feel thick. "Think of it this way. She has a choice. She chooses him. She chooses his $53,000 in credit card debt, his car lease, and his parasitic nature. She chooses herself. She chooses the security her mother and I built for her. I'm not taking away her choice. I am giving her the one thing he never has, the truth. It is the clearest, most honest choice I can possibly give her." Patricia was silent for a long moment, studying the face of the man she had known for 20 years. She saw the pain behind the resolve, the surgeon's grim determination to cut away a cancer to save the patient. She picked up her pen. "It's your estate, Wilbur. I will draft it as you wish." 2 days later, the documents were signed, notarized, and filed. The new last will and testament of Wilbur Hayes was a masterpiece of legal precision and psychological warfare. But he had no intention of sending the 12-page document to his daughter. A weapon that is fully revealed loses its power to terrorize. He needed to plant a seed of doubt, not hand her a declaration of war. Back in his library, he took out a single sheet of his heavy, cream-colored personal stationery. He wrote a short, brutally ambiguous letter. "Georgiana, this is to inform you that, in light of recent events, I have met with my attorney and made significant revisions to my estate planning documents. Your inheritance is no longer guaranteed and is now subject to conditional terms which have been clearly stipulated in my new will. Sincerely, your father." He folded the single sheet, slipped it into a matching envelope, and addressed it to the drab, soulless corporate apartment where his daughter was living in a state of suspended reality. He didn't send it by regular mail. He took it to the post office and sent it via registered mail, requiring a signature upon delivery. He had checked the delivery schedules. He timed it perfectly. The letter would arrive on Thursday afternoon. Leroy's first court appearance for the assault charge was scheduled for Saturday morning. Wilbert placed the certified mail receipt on his desk next to the private investigator's report. He had armed the bomb, he had set the timer, he wanted Adele to arrive before the trial, to sit with them in that beige apartment for 48 hours, growing like a crack in the foundation of their marriage. He wanted Leroy to feel a tremor of panic. He wanted Georgiana, as she sat in that courtroom, to look at her husband not just as a man who had committed an act of violence, but as an investment that was suddenly, terrifyingly, at risk of default. The Maricopa County Superior Courtroom was a place built to diminish the individual. The ceilings were impossibly high, the wood of the benches was dark and unforgiving, and everything smelled of old paper and a low-grade collective anxiety. Wilbur sat in the third row on the aisle, a silent, unmovable spectator. He had chosen the seat for his tactical advantage, not close enough to seem like a participant, but too close to be ignored. He was a statue carved from judgment, his gaze fixed not on Leroy, but on the great seal of the state of Arizona hanging on the wall behind the judge's bench. In the front row, Georgiana sat beside Leroy, her posture ramrod straight. Her hand was clamped around her expensive leather handbag with such force that her knuckles were white. Inside that purse, nestled between her wallet and a tube of Chanel lipstick, was a cream-colored envelope from her father. It had arrived 2 days ago, a registered letter that felt like a ticking bomb in her hand. She hadn't opened it. She was afraid to. Its ambiguous, ominous message had been enough to curdle the air between her and Leroy for 48 agonizing hours, a silent third party in their beige, rented apartment. Leroy's lawyer, a slick man with a confident smile, had worked a minor miracle, a plea deal. Leroy would plead guilty to a lesser charge of misdemeanor assault. No jail time, a significant fine, a series of mandatory anger management classes, and 18 months of probation. It was a victory, a clean exit from a catastrophic mess. All Leroy had to do was nod, sign the papers, and walk out the door a free, if chastened, man. Georgiana felt a wave of profound, exhausted relief wash over her as the judge accepted the plea. It was over. The proceedings concluded. The judge, a man named Alistair Monroe who had been on the bench for 32 years and had the weary, impatient expression to prove it, shuffled his papers. "This court is adjourned," he grumbled. Georgiana stood, pulling on Leroy's arm, desperate to escape the suffocating solemnity of the room. They turned to leave, and their path took them directly past the row where Wilbur sat. Leroy saw him. Their eyes met for a brief, charged second across the space of a few feet. Wilbur's expression was utterly neutral, but it was more potent than any accusation. It was the calm, observing gaze of a man who had already won. And Leroy, high on the adrenaline of his near miss with incarceration, his pride still stinging, simply couldn't help himself. He stopped. A moth to a flame, Wilbur thought, not even turning his head. "You," Leroy hissed, his voice a venomous whisper that still carried in the quiet room. He took a half step toward the pew, pointing a trembling finger at his father-in-law. "You regret this, old man. This is your fault. You ruined everything." The public defender, 2 rows back, froze mid-briefcase snap. Georgiana's hand flew to her mouth, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. Judge Monroe, who had been about to rise, stopped dead. He had seen murderers weep and saints lie. What he had no time for, absolutely none, was sheer, unadulterated stupidity. The crack of his gavel was like a rifle shot. "Mr. Evans!" The judge's voice boomed, shedding its weariness and taking on the thunder of absolute authority. "Approach the bench. Now." Leroy froze, the color draining from his face. His lawyer spun around, his expression a mask of horror. "Your Honor, my client is overwrought. I am not speaking to you, counselor," Judge Monroe snapped. He leveled a stony glare at Leroy. "You, here, now." Like a man walking to his own execution, Leroy trudged back to the defendant's table. Georgiana stood paralyzed in the aisle. The judge leaned over the bench, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Son, did you just threaten a man, the victim in this case, in my courtroom, after I just accepted a plea deal that is, frankly, Far more lenient than you deserve? No, Your Honor. I don't want to hear it. The judge cut him off. I don't care what you just. I care what I just saw and heard. And what I saw was a man with a dangerous lack of impulse control, who clearly has no respect for the authority of this court. He picked up the freshly signed plea agreement and tapped it with a thick finger. We're going to make a little amendment. Your probation terms now include mandatory weekly, in-person check-ins with your probation officer, and you will be fitted with a GPS monitoring device for the first 6 months, the cost of which you will bear. He leaned forward even further. Any violation being late for a check-in, an unapproved trip out of town, so much as a harsh word to your father-in-law that gets back to me and your probation's revoked, you will serve the maximum sentence for the original charge. Do you understand me? Leroy could only manage a choked "Yes, Your Honor." As they finally walked out of the courthouse and into the blinding Arizona sun, the air of relief was gone, replaced by the suffocating reality of what had just happened. Georgiana didn't reach for her husband's hand. She didn't offer a word of comfort. She stopped at the top of the white stone steps and she looked at him, really looked at him. The defiant anger she had felt on his behalf, the narrative she had clung to of her father's cold cruelty, evaporated in the harsh light. For the first time, she saw him not as her husband, the man she had promised to love and protect, but as Judge Monroe saw him, as her father saw him, a liability, a man so consumed by his own pride that he would snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, a danger not just to others, but to himself and to anyone tethered to him. The crack of doubt that her father's letter had created had just been violently split open into a chasm, and for the first time, Georgiana felt the terrifying sensation of falling. I guess 99% of you will hear this, sigh and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second, what time is it for you and where are you listening? Life in the beige apartment was a special kind of hell, a slow, suffocating descent from their previously gilded lives. The thin walls were a constant reminder of their proximity to strangers. The smell of their neighbors' garlic-heavy cooking seeped under the door, a constant, greasy miasma. Leroy, stripped of his expensive suits and the insulating buffer of wealth, was a different man. The court-mandated GPS monitor was a thick, plastic humiliation strapped to his ankle, and the weekly, in-person check-ins with a world-weary probation officer chipped away at his fragile ego. The financial strain was a constant, grinding pressure. Fines, legal fees, the rent on this sad, temporary box, it all added up. His frustration, having no other outlet, was directed entirely at Georgiana. He became sullen, irritable, his temper a tripwire she tiptoed around daily. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, while Leroy was out at a mandated anger management class, Georgiana sat on the lumpy sofa, the silence of the apartment a welcome reprieve. Her hand strayed to her purse, her fingers brushing against the crisp edges of her father's letter. She had transferred it from her court handbag to her everyday one, carrying it around like a talisman or a curse. With trembling fingers, she finally pulled it out and slid the envelope open. Significant revisions to my estate planning document. Your inheritance is no longer guaranteed and is now subject to conditional terms. The words were cold, clinical, and utterly terrifying in their vagueness. A condition? What condition could a father place on his own daughter's inheritance? The seed of doubt, planted in the courtroom, began to sprout thorny, grasping vines in her mind. She thought of her father's words on the porch, "I am revealing his hand." What hand? What was he playing? That night, she waited until Leroy was asleep, his heavy, whiskey-scented snores filling the small bedroom. She slipped out of bed and went to the small desk in the living room where he left his laptop open. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This felt like a betrayal, an intrusion. But the alternative living in this fog of fear and suspicion was no longer tenable. She wasn't a detective, but she was a wife. She knew the password to his laptop was the name of his college mascot, a detail he was far too proud of. The screen flickered to life, displaying a chaotic desktop of spreadsheets and browser tabs. She opened the web browser. She didn't have to look for passwords. They were all saved. his credit card accounts, the bank. With a shaky hand, she clicked on the first link. The screen filled with the cheerful blue and white logo of American Express. And then the numbers. A balance of $21,487, a minimum payment that was more than their weekly grocery budget. She clicked on the next link. Visa, another $12,000. A third card, a MasterCard, held another 10. The numbers swam before her eyes. A dizzying, sickening tide of debt she had known nothing about. $43,000. Then she saw it. A tab for her own retirement account. Fidelity Investments. Her blood ran cold. She clicked. The login was saved. Her name, her future, displayed on his screen. She navigated to the transaction history, and there it was. 6 months ago, hardship withdrawal, $5,000. 4 months ago, hardship withdrawal, $4,500. And the last one, just before the incident at the house, hardship withdrawal, $15,000. The screen blurred as tears welled in her eyes. It wasn't just the money, it was the violation. He had been systematically gutting her future, stealing the money she had so carefully saved, while buying her expensive dinners and telling her everything was fine. The foundation of her world didn't just crack, it disintegrated into dust. The next morning, she did not cry. The tears had been burned away by a cold, clarifying rage. She printed the statements, the pages warm from the cheap inkjet printer. She waited until Leroy had his coffee, then she walked into the living room and placed the papers on the coffee table in front of him. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. $15,000, Leroy, from my retirement, and $43,000 in credit card debt you never told me about. She looked him directly in the eye. What future were you building with my money? For a moment, he looked genuinely stunned, a fish gasping for air on a dry dock. Then, cornered and exposed, he switched from defense to attack, his face twisting into a familiar, resentful sneer. I did it for us, for our future, he shouted, his voice rising. You think this lifestyle comes for free? Your father cut us off. I did what I had to do. You stole from me, she said. The words simple, solid facts. You're just like him, he screamed, his last pathetic volley. All you care about is money. I thought you loved me. The emotional manipulation that had once been so effective was now just noise. It was the desperate tantrum of a child. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw nothing left of the man she thought she had married. There was only a hollow shell of greed and blame. I think you love my father's money, she said quietly, and I was just part of the investment. Without another word, she turned and walked into the bedroom. She pulled a small suitcase from the closet and began to pack, her movements efficient and calm. Leroy followed her, still screaming, his words a meaningless torrent of accusations and pleas. She zipped the bag, walked past him as if he were a piece of furniture, and headed for the door. She didn't look back. The drive was a blur. She didn't know where she was going until she found herself on a familiar road, the afternoon sun dappling through the mesquite trees. She saw the turn, the white gates, the perfectly manicured bougainvillea. She pulled up to the call box, her hand hovering for a moment before she pressed the button. A voice, calm and familiar, came through the speaker. Yes? Dad, she said, and her own voice broke, the single word carrying the weight of everything she had lost and everything she hoped to find. It's me. There was a pause, and then the sound of the gate buzzing open. As she drove down the long, familiar driveway, she saw him standing on the porch, waiting. She pulled the car to a stop, got out, and let out the breath she felt as if she'd been holding for 8 months. She was home. Wilbur watched his daughter walk toward him, saw the exhaustion and the pain in her eyes, but also a flicker of something new, a hard-won strength. He didn't say, I told you so. He didn't need to. He simply opened the door wider and said the only 2 words that mattered. Welcome home, Georgiana.